All right. Hello, everybody. I hope we're doing well. So today's going to be the last day of this section of the course, and you guys have an exam coming up. I'll be sending you guys some information about the exam, or maybe I already have. So anyway, let's jump right into the problem of divine hiddenness. All right. All right. So the problem of divine hiddenness is related to these discussions we've been having on the problem of evil, right? So this is yet another argument or subset of arguments that's directed against God's existence on the basis of the problem of evil or the problem of evil broadly. So before we get into the actual problem of divine hiddenness, we need to get a little terminology on the table. So the first thing is we got to think about the nature of the afterlife. That is, who is getting into heaven and who isn't getting into heaven. So religious people of any religion might have three different views about the nature of salvation. Okay, the most commonly held view, at least for uh, for denominations that you might be familiar with, is salvific exclusivism. This is the view that there are both necessary and sufficient conditions for salvation, right? So there are necessary conditions insofar as if you don't meet those conditions, then you don't achieve salvation. Okay, and so how we construe what the necessary conditions are might be subject to debate. And so they might be things like you have to believe in the true religion, you got to believe in God, you got to believe in a perfectly omnipotent and omniscient creator. Uh, you have to participate in certain rituals of the true religion. So if I want to go to heaven, I have to be baptized, say. If I want to go to heaven, I have to participate in certain Islamic rituals, right? So we might construe these necessary conditions in any number of ways. Now, uh, the key here is that anybody who doesn't believe the right way or anybody that doesn't participate in the rituals does not get to go to heaven, does not get salvation. That's the point here. Okay, then there's this other view called salvific inclusivism. Inclusivism says that there are merely sufficient conditions for salvation. There are no necessary conditions. So that means that somebody who isn't in the correct religion can still get to go to heaven on the basis of the true religion, right? So, I mean, think about you've probably thought about this before. If you're a religious person, you've probably thought about, well, what about a person who is isolated from the rest of the world and they don't hear anything having to do with the gospel, right? What about that person? Is that person going to go to hell because they never knew, but it's no fault of their own? An inclusivist would say something like, "Well, maybe they might, right? Because it's not their fault, and there's potentially several different ways to get into heaven, right?" An inclusivist might respond that way, whereas the exclusivist would probably be forced to say something like, "Well, of course not. They're not going to go to heaven." Right? And so there's a distinction between these different views of the nature of salvation. And I'm including a third view. This is salvific pluralism. And this is the idea that there is no true religion, right? And so no religion is better or worse than any other religion. And so there might be some sufficient conditions for salvation, but it's not in virtue of believing in the true religion, right? Um, So we're not going to look at that one quite as much. We're mainly going to focus on exclusivism and inclusivism, but you'll need to be able to identify all three of these different views. All right, now on to the actual argument from divine hiddenness, the argument against God's existence from divine hiddenness. Okay, premise one: if a perfectly loving God exists, then this God would ensure that all sincere seekers would find him, right? So here we have a claim about God's nature, one of God's attributes, perfectly loving. So if God is perfectly loving, God is going to make sure that everybody that's looking for God finds God, right? Okay, premise two: there are some sincere seekers who do not find God. Okay, so given that God, if he's perfectly loving, he would make sure that everybody that's really looking for God finds God. It follows that, and given that there are some sincere seekers who never find God, it follows that God is not perfectly loving. It follows that a perfectly loving God does not exist as well. So there are several different ways that we could say, okay, well, God still exists. He's just not perfectly loving. Maybe he's partially loving. Maybe he's evil, right? There are other possibilities. So this is excluding a perfectly loving God from existing. So this argument is kind of focused at one specific divine attribute and then saying that God does not have that divine attribute. Okay, good. So another thing that we might think about, in philosophy, we're always trying to define our terms. What is a sincere seeker? Well, this is somebody who really wants to know whether or not God exists. They are trying to evaluate all of the evidence, right? And maybe they have a lot of evidence, but they just don't have quite enough to believe, in a way that if God were to present himself to them, then they would believe, right? So maybe they're at an evidential threshold such that belief is really close, but they fail to believe because they don't have an experience of God, right? And so we can distinguish sincere seekers from people who are maybe culpable non-believers. This means that they have plenty of evidence for thinking that God exists, but they ignore it, or they choose not to believe, or they believe in spite of the evidence, right? And so we're focused on sincere seekers, people whose heart is really in the right place, right? Okay. So let's think about premise one. Why think that premise one is plausible? Well, there's a couple of reasons to think that premise one is plausible. Consider a case. Suppose that there's a young child who is visiting the city with his mother. Okay, let's suppose that the child accidentally gets astray from the mother and is alone, right? And so is walking the streets, saying, "Mom, Mom, where are you? Where are you, Mom? Like I can't find you. I'm scared," right? Let's imagine that the mother is watching the child call out for the mother, right? But she's not responding. She's not presenting herself to the child. We might say that this person sounds like kind of a bad mother, right? This doesn't seem like a thing that a loving mother would do. In a similar way, we might say that God is kind of like the mother, right? When there's one of God's children is crying out for God, to present God's self, we might say that in virtue of not responding, God is kind of being like that mother who doesn't seem to be doing the right thing. So if God's going to be perfectly loving, then it seems like God would make himself known, would reveal himself to all sincere seekers in some relevant kind of way. In the same way that a good mother is going to make herself known to the child that's lost. That's a motivating example. So premise one initially seems plausible, and we have some motivation to accept it. Let's think about a little bit more about refining premise one. Okay, so we're going to need a little bit of revision. I'm sure you guys remember from some of our previous class meetings that we talked about whether or not God has morally sufficient reason for allowing evil. So recall that a morally sufficient reason is a kind of overriding reason, right? So if I subject my son to chemotherapy, right, I'm subjecting him to a lot of suffering and harm, making him undergo a lot of suffering, right? That's a bad thing, right? But I'm doing it for a good reason, right? Namely to get rid of his cancer. And so we would say that I have a morally sufficient reason for allowing my son to suffer. Similarly, God can have morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil. Now, so how does this affect premise one? Well, it's saying that God might have a morally sufficient reason for hiding God's self from sincere seekers. Okay? So we have to build that possibility in to premise one. And so we need to revise premise one as premise one star. If a perfectly loving God exists, then this God would ensure that all sincere seekers would find him, unless God has morally sufficient reason to allow seekers not to find him, right? Unless God has a good reason for hiding himself. You got to leave that possibility open, right? So we're going to revise the argument as such. So there's premise one star, which we've already talked about. Then there's premise two, the empirical claim that there's some sincere seekers who don't find God. But then there's premise three. God has no morally sufficient reason for allowing sincere seekers to not find him. So the claim here is that, okay, we're open to the possibility that God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing some people not to find him. Okay, open to that possibility. And now premise three is going to close off that possibility. No, God does not have such a morally sufficient reason. Okay, and so if God has no morally sufficient reason for hiding God's self, God still hides God's self from sincere seekers. It seems like God is not perfectly loving. That's a problem, right? For a theist. If you're an atheist, this is just one more argument to put into your repertoire of arguments against God's existence. But if you believe in God, if you're a theist, then you have some skin in the game here. So how can we respond to this argument? And we're going to think about that. But first, let's think about what the big deal is. Okay, so why is it such a big deal that God hide God's self? Why is it such a big deal that some sincere seekers don't believe in God or don't come to the belief that God exists? Well, we might say that it's problematic that somebody doesn't arrive at belief in the true religion, right? Okay. Um, or we could say that they don't arrive at the belief that there's a good God, a powerful God, and a creator, right? Maybe they lack that. And maybe there's good reason to hold that belief, right? Maybe that belief is good for somebody. And so they're missing out on that good. But and I think I think interpretation 3 is the one that raises the stakes the most. Interpretation 3 says that sincere seekers do not arrive at salvation because they don't believe in God. Okay, so the idea here is that, well, they don't believe in God, then they're going to go to hell, right? Okay, and they wouldn't have gone to hell. They would have believed in God if God would have just made himself apparent to them, would have just revealed God's self. And so it seems like it's God's fault that they're in hell. If God would have just would have performed a miracle for them, or would have presented himself in some kind of relevant way to these people, given them a little bit more evidence, well, then they would have believed and they would have been in heaven. But because God hid himself, it follows that they went to hell because it's partially God's fault. And because it's God's fault, this seems to undermine God's loving character. And that seems to be a problem, right? Okay. So let's think back a little bit more to what we talked about at the first of the lecture. Inclusivism and exclusivism. Okay, so it seems like it seems like the problem of divine hiddenness is only a problem if we accept exclusivism and reject inclusivism. So the idea here is that it's necessary to have salvation to believe in God. So belief in God is necessary for getting into heaven. If you don't believe in God, or you don't believe in the true religion, or whatever, you're going to go to hell. Okay. Uh, on inclusivism, there might be some people who don't believe in God, who don't believe in the true religion, who are still able to get to heaven, perhaps based on other merits, or for some other reason, right? Um, so the idea is that on exclusivism, these sincere seekers, in virtue of not believing in God, go automatically to hell. However, on inclusivism, we might say that these sincere seekers, for some other reason, might get to heaven, right? Maybe it's in virtue of being a sincere seeker that God lets you into heaven. Maybe that's a sufficient condition for salvation. I don't know, but maybe it is. So it seems like in order for this argument to work, we have to be salvific exclusivists. Okay, well, why is that? Well, it seems like there doesn't seem to be as much of a problem if we accept inclusivism. That is, the problem of divine hiddenness doesn't seem to mean that much if we accept inclusivism, because sincere seekers could get into heaven in other kinds of ways, right? Belief isn't necessary for salvation, whereas belief is necessary for salvation on some exclusivist views. Okay, so that means that we yet again have to revise this argument. So we're going to build in premise 0, is that correct beliefs about God are necessary for salvation. That is, inclusivism is false. Okay. So if we say that inclusivism is false and that correct beliefs about God are necessary for salvation, then we can really push the problem of divine hiddenness. then it really, really, really seems to be a problem. Okay, good. So how are we going to respond to this argument? Or how is a theist going to respond to this argument? So just take a minute, pause the video, and think about if you can identify an objection to this argument. Can you show that one of these premises is false? Can you show that somehow the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises? That's a helpful thing to do, to think about these things. And that'll help you with your writing assignment as well. So let's think about some responses, some natural responses. So first of all, premise 3. So God has no morally sufficient reason for allowing sincere seekers to not find him. Here are 2 responses. Okay, here's one. Well, maybe God does have a morally sufficient reason, right? And maybe we can actually think of good, morally sufficient reasons for God to hide himself from us sometimes, from sincere seekers. It might be that in virtue of God not making himself apparent, that it builds our faith, it builds our character in the right kind of way, right? Maybe there's some good that we can receive from God not being so apparent to us. So if we can offer a morally sufficient reason for why God hides God's self, then we can show that premise 3, we can call premise 3 into question, and we might be able to falsify it, because premise 3 says that there are no morally sufficient reasons that God could have. And then we start saying, well, here are some morally sufficient reasons. Maybe they're plausible. Then we can start to call premise 3 into question. Okay, good. So the second option is a position called skeptical theism. Skeptical theism is super interesting. The view is that God has an infinitely greater evidential threshold than we do. Okay, so God's omniscient. That means he knows the truth value of all propositions, right? So God knows all kinds of stuff that we don't know. So given that, even if we can't offer a morally sufficient reason for God allowing evil, then we can say, well, God is infinitely greater in knowledge than we are. And therefore, he probably has a pretty good reason for allowing some evil, even if we can't conceive of it, even if we can't imagine it. So the idea here is that we can't conclude that God has no such morally sufficient reason for allowing an evil, because God is infinitely smarter than we are, right? So we can't attribute to God that he has no morally sufficient reason. That's the idea. So if skeptical theism is plausible, then we falsify premise 3. We say, we just can't say that God has no morally sufficient reason. Well, why? Well, because our evidential threshold, we don't have as much evidence as God does. God just has some reason that we don't know about for allowing some evil to occur. And so if that's plausible, then God has a morally sufficient reason, regardless of whether or not we can talk about it and explain it. So let's go into a little bit more detail about the first account here, the theistic explanation of hiddenness. So and we talked on this a little bit earlier. The idea here is that God hides himself from us, or allows certain evils to occur, in a manner that perhaps promotes our free will, in a manner that facilitates maturity, facilitates faith, right? We have to do some things on our own. And when we do those kinds of things on our own, we act even though God is not present to us. We have to really, really believe that God exists in order to do that. So when, in virtue of distancing himself, there are certain goods that come to us, right? And so if that's plausible, that might be a good candidate for a morally sufficient reason for God hiding himself from some sincere seekers, right? And if that's plausible, then we can once again call premise 3 into question. Now, there's one other response that I want to chat about. So one natural response to the revised problem of divine hiddenness is that we reject exclusivism. We kind of talked about that earlier, but I want to bring this up to the forefront now. If we reject exclusivism in favor of inclusivism, then the argument loses a lot of its bite. It might still be a problem, but it doesn't seem to be quite as big of a deal. So if we can reject premise 0 by rejecting exclusivism, or we can reject premise 2 by either being skeptical theists or offering examples of morally sufficient reasons